The Vikings' victory over the Bears ended 27-24, but the final score hides a much deeper problem that proved costly in Dublin. In both games, against Chicago in Week 1 and against Pittsburgh in Week 4, Minnesota came out asleep through the first 3 quarters and only woke up when it was already too late. Against the Bears, the comeback came in the final minute. Against the Steelers, 24-21, there was no time to respond. What was ignored in those 2 losses cannot be repeated in London against the Browns, or the season will completely derail. J.J. McCarthy made his debut at Soldier Field, and the first 3 quarters were a complete nightmare. Only 6 points scored by the start of the 4th quarter, 19 offensive plays in the first half, drives dying before gaining traction. The first series ended with a sack by Gervon Dexter on 3rd down. Another 3 and out followed shortly after. McCarthy was sacked again in the 2nd quarter, losing 6 crucial yards, and the result was just 2 field goals from Will Reichard, including a record 59-yarder at Soldier Field. But field goals do not win games when the offense is completely stuck. Stay tuned, because soon we will show how the Vikings' offensive line completely collapsed in the first 3 quarters against the Bears, and how the same mistake was repeated against the Steelers, forcing the quarterbacks to play under constant pressure without enough time to process defensive coverages. In the 3rd quarter against Chicago came the lowest point of the night. Nahshon Wright, a former member of the Vikings practice squad, intercepted a McCarthy pass intended for Justin Jefferson and returned it 74 yards for a touchdown. 17-6 on the scoreboard, and it looked like the debut would be remembered as a complete disaster. But the mistake was not just that bad throw, it was the sum of incomplete drives, wasted 3rd downs, broken protections, and an offensive line that never managed to give McCarthy enough time to calmly process the plays. That pattern reappeared in identical fashion in Week 4 in Dublin. Carson Wentz, who had taken over after McCarthy's injury in Week 2 against the Falcons, was sacked 6 times against the Steelers. T.J. Watt and Nick Herbig had a field day while the offensive line crumbled piece by piece. Brian O'Neill went out in the 1st quarter with a knee injury. Ryan Kelly was diagnosed with a concussion for the 2nd time this season. Donovan Jackson was already out after wrist surgery. What remained was a line made up of 3 backups trying to hold off one of the most aggressive defenses in the NFL. Both of Wentz's interceptions had exactly the same origin: failed protection forcing him to release the ball without a proper base and without completing progressions. First, a pass over the middle was deflected at the line by Derek Harmon and intercepted by Deshaun Elliott. Then, in the 3rd quarter, T.J. Watt deflected another pass at the line of scrimmage and intercepted it himself, returning 12 yards and putting Pittsburgh in favorable position to score. Soon, we will reveal why long 3rd downs turned into an absolute graveyard of drives in both Week 1 and Week 4 games, killing any attempt to establish offensive rhythm before the 4th quarter even began. Against the Steelers, 3rd downs were absolutely devastating. Whenever Minnesota faced 3rd and more than 7 yards to gain, it became an open invitation for Pittsburgh's defense to apply maximum pressure. In the 2nd quarter, 3rd and 12 yards, sack by Nick Herbig killing the drive. In the 3rd quarter, the line gave up 2 consecutive sacks, first T.J. Watt breaking in from the right, then Deshaun Elliott finding a hole in the middle for another sack and also forcing a fumble. The same pattern had appeared in Week 1 against Chicago. McCarthy faced constant pressure on long 3rd downs, with sacks from Montez Sweat and pressures that forced hurried throws. Kevin O'Connell tried to adjust the scheme by calling quick passes and screens to neutralize the pressure, but the damage was already done. Pittsburgh and Chicago entered the games knowing that on long 3rd downs, the pocket would not last more than 3 seconds. Now, against Cleveland, Myles Garrett will enter the game knowing exactly where to attack. In the 4th quarter against Chicago, everything suddenly changed. McCarthy completed 8 of 11 passes for 95 yards and 2 touchdowns after the interception. First, he connected with Jefferson for a 13-yard touchdown. Then, in just 3 plays, he found Aaron Jones wide open for another 27-yard touchdown. And then, to seal the victory, McCarthy ran 14 yards for yet another touchdown on the ground. 21 points in a single quarter. He became the first quarterback in NFL history to produce 3 touchdowns in the 4th quarter of his professional debut. Soon, we will show how in Dublin, it was exactly the same story of a late reaction in the final quarter of the game, but this time without a happy ending because Pittsburgh did not hand the game away the way Chicago had. But here is the problem that cannot be ignored. This offensive explosion in the fourth quarter did not happen because the game plan changed drastically, or because O'Connell made brilliant tactical adjustments. It happened because Chicago started committing critical mistakes. Cairo Santos missed a 50-yard field goal that would have made it 17-9 and practically sealed the game. The Bears committed 12 penalties for 127 yards, many of them at decisive moments. Caleb Williams, who had dominated the first 3 quarters, began forcing throws and lost timing with his receivers. Minnesota simply capitalized on the opponent's mistakes, but did not solve the structural problems that had stalled the offense until that point. In Dublin, Wentz also led 2 touchdown drives in the fourth quarter, trying to mount a comeback. First, a 70-yard drive ending with a pass to Xavier Scott in the back of the end zone. Then, with Jordan Addison making a spectacular 81-yard reception that put the offense in prime position, Wentz connected with Jalen Nailor for another touchdown. From 6-0 on the scoreboard, Minnesota reached 21 points and nearly forced overtime, but almost does not count on the final score. The last drive of the game perfectly sums up everything that was wrong. Less than 2 minutes on the clock, Minnesota with a real chance to tie the game with a field goal, but the offensive line collapsed once again at the most critical moment. First came an intentional grounding penalty that cost precious yards. Then came a delay of game penalty, wasting crucial seconds off the clock. Finally, on fourth down, the incomplete pass ended the game without even giving Will Reichard the chance to attempt the tying kick. Against the Browns in London, this pattern of a complete blackout in the first 3 quarters simply cannot be repeated. Cleveland is 1-3 in the season, but they have a defense that knows how to pressure quarterbacks from the first snap and will exploit every gap in protection. If Minnesota does not wake up from the opening kickoff, the hole will be far too deep to escape with just a fourth quarter explosion. The Vikings have shown 2 completely different faces over these first 4 weeks. In Week 3 against the Bengals, everything worked perfectly with a 48-10 victory. Wentz debuted calmly, completing 14 of 20 passes with 2 touchdowns and 0 turnovers, while Isaiah Rodgers made history with 2 defensive touchdowns. But here is the critical detail. That victory came with the defense carrying the team on its back. When the defense does not dominate like that, as in weeks 1, 2, and 4, the offense completely stalls through the first 3 quarters. Soon, we will show how the lack of a running game left the offense predictable, making the defense's job easier and eliminating any chance of the offensive balance necessary to win. Without a stable offensive line, the running game disappeared. Mason finished Week 4 with only 52 yards on 14 attempts, several runs for 0 or 1 yard, including a stop on 3rd and 1. Without Kelly at center, the interior line could not open holes, and without O'Neal, the right side was pushed back. When the run does not work, the offense becomes predictable, giving Pittsburgh the freedom to alternate blitzes and exploit vulnerabilities. The final drive in Dublin perfectly sums up this entire structural collapse. Soon, we will reveal what urgently needs to change against the Browns, because repeating this pattern means burying any chance of recovery in the season. Compare the final drive in Dublin with Week 1 against Chicago. Drives stalled at critical moments in both games. The difference? Chicago collapsed in the fourth quarter. Santos missed a field goal, 12 penalties, Williams forced throws. Minnesota capitalized on the opponent's mistakes, not because it solved structural problems, as those issues still continued through Week 4. Against Pittsburgh, there were no mistakes to capitalize on. Rodgers played with patience at 41 years old. The defense stayed disciplined until the end. When Minnesota needed a perfect drive, the offensive line collapsed. In Week 2 against the Falcons at home, the blackout pattern was confirmed as systemic. McCarthy took 6 sacks, threw 2 interceptions, and lost a fumble in the 22-6 defeat. Atlanta pressured on 53.5% of dropbacks, the highest rate since 2018. The line did not hold, and without the defense compensating with turnovers, Minnesota had no response whatsoever. This game showed that when the opponent does not commit critical mistakes and the Vikings' defense does not dominate, the Vikings' offense simply does not know how to win in the first 3 quarters. Now we will consolidate why London is much more than just another game and can define the course of the entire Vikings season. Against Cleveland, the situation is clear. The Browns are 1-3 but defend the run well and have a defensive line that will test protection from the first snap. Garrett will hunt Wentz for 60 minutes. If the line does not hold in the first 2 quarters, it will be the familiar script, offensive blackout and desperate running at the end that will not be enough to secure a win in the fourth quarter. What needs to change? First, establish the run early with Mason receiving 20 carries, forcing Cleveland to respect the ground game. Second, Wentz needs to release quickly with short passes, screens to Jefferson and Addison because the protection will not hold for 5 seconds. Third, and most importantly, wake up from the kickoff. There cannot be 3 quarters asleep followed by a frantic fourth quarter. O'Connell needs to bring the intensity of the fourth quarter to the first snap, whether with aggressive play calls or pace adjustments. London is not just week 5, it is the moment to show whether they learned from their mistakes or will continue the self-destructive pattern. 2-2 in the record that could have been 4-0 if they had woken up before the fourth quarter. Dublin was the first international loss after 4 consecutive wins outside the United States. London could be redemption or confirmation that this team does not know how to win when it gets tough from the first quarter. What was ignored against the Bears and Steelers is glaring. The line failed in the first 3 quarters, the run game did not create balance, long third downs became a graveyard, and fourth quarter intensity never appeared when it really mattered to build leads instead of chasing the game. Against the Browns, ignoring this again means another loss where talent does not compensate for structural flaws. There is still time. Wentz has the experience to adjust, the line can find chemistry, and O'Connell has proven he can motivate for impossible comebacks. But motivation is not enough when execution from the first snap is what separates teams fighting for the playoffs from mid-table teams looking for excuses. Cleveland will arrive knowing exactly where to attack. If Minnesota does not correct this, history will repeat itself, and this time there will be no comeback to save the day. Thank you for following and see you soon.